But there are a few things that the US needs to think very closely about. The US needs to have a much more of a sense of focus in the way it thinks about the world. I live in Washington, and on any given day in Washington, D.C., you can go to a talk where someone will tell you that every country in the world is a vital American national security interest. Be it East Africa, Central Asia, literally every nook and cranny on the planet, it's absolutely crucial that we are there. And the war on terror really plays up to this, because there are people who operate under the Al-Qaeda banner in all sorts of countries and all sorts of places. And it really creates this sense that the US needs to be absolutely present everywhere. But when you're facing a challenge like the US is now going to face in the coming decades from China, the US has to be much more focused, more disciplined. It has to decide which of the bits of the world it's really interested in, that thinks is really important, and which of the bits of the world it's not quite so interested in. And so if you're thinking about something like whether the US should get involved in the Syrian civil war, which has been this issue that's been raging in Washington for the last couple of years, if you think about it in terms of, well, you've got this kind of long-term contest with China, then you start to think, well, we need to be very, very careful that we don't get sucked into another one of these conflicts. There are all sorts of other reasons to not want to get involved in the Syrian civil war, but this is another one that the US needs to start thinking about. Another important part of this is actually diplomacy. It's important to have the right military approach and the right military assets, but diplomacy is going to be very crucial here. And this was something that Hillary Clinton was fantastic at in Asia. Basically, her strategy was she was going to go everywhere. She went to every meeting, she showed up everywhere. It didn't matter how obscure the meeting was, how dull the agenda was, how unimportant it was. She was there, she showed her face. And this is actually very important, because the whole underlying idea behind the pivot is one of kind of staying power. It's about the US showing that it's in Asia for the long run. And by being there in a very disciplined and patient manner, Hillary Clinton gave that impression. In the last year, the US has already kind of dropped the ball a little bit on that. For all sorts of good reasons, John Kerry, Secretary of State, is very much focused on the Middle East. It's about Iran, Israeli-Palestinian peace talks, about Syria. And in the process, he's given the impression in Asia that the US has already got distracted, and the US is already looking elsewhere. And same thing with the president. He was supposed to go on a trip to Asia last year, and he cancelled it because of the government shutdown, because he had to stay at home and fight fires at home. And the Chinese have been going around for the last 6 months, going around Asia saying, look, we told you guys, the US, they came on strong for a couple of years, and they've already given up. They've already found a new toy. They've already got distracted. They've gone somewhere else. You cannot rely on them. So it requires very patient, disciplined diplomacy. And the final thing I think that the US is going to have to do, and which is actually really hard to do, is to develop an economic strategy and an economic story that links America's prosperity to Asia's prosperity. If you think about it just purely from a policy point of view, this is a no-brainer. Everyone in this country understands that to really revive the economy is going to require much more expansion in manufacturing, expansion in exports, to create the kind of jobs that will really sustain middle-class salaries. And there's no way of doing that without the US becoming much more present in Asian markets, becoming much more linked to Asian markets. These are the fastest growing, most dynamic, biggest markets in the world in the coming decades. But that's an incredibly hard message to try and sell at the moment, because there's so much skepticism about globalization, about trade. And you had during the last election campaign, Mitt Romney and Barack Obama were running around Ohio complaining about Chinese cheaters. That goes down very badly in China, but it also goes down very badly in Asia as well. Asian countries hear that kind of language, and they think that the US is just looking inwards. It's just becoming less dynamic, less engaged with the world, and consumed by its own problems. So the US is going to have to find a way to talk to itself and to the region about a way that will describe its own future prosperity, its own future economic vitality as being closely linked with Asia.